Welcome to Keep the Line Moving, the podcast where leadership meets life and inspiration. Here we spotlight extraordinary leaders. We're diving deep into how they inspire, motivate, and lead with strategy and empathy to achieve the extraordinary. Here we go. Episode 127 of the podcast. What a rich conversation we have for you this week. I hope you like them all, but this one's a little longer. You'll see why. It's with my former colleague and friend, Yeshayah Goldfarb, who started with the San Francisco Giants in December of 2000 and then spent 24 years with the organization, rising as an intern, a coordinator, a director, a senior director, and then most recently, before leaving the organization in January, he was vice president, baseball resources and development. We will talk about scouting, analytics, intuition, player development, and how did Yeshayah see all of it? And also the stories he has from his mentors, Dick Tidrow, Brian Sabian, Bobby Evans. And we talk about the rich front office of the San Francisco Giants, getting them to 3 world championships in 2010, 12, and 14. But this conversation is about Yeshayah and how he developed as a professional, which is excellent for all of you listening, whether you're at the vice president, senior vice president, or even CEO level, because we dive into the nuances of leadership and culture, or because Yeshayah has some great advice if you're going to enter the world of professional sports and baseball specifically. So much here. It begins now with Yeshayah Goldfarb. All right, Yeshayah. First of all, welcome. How are you, my friend?
Hey, I am doing great. I really appreciate you having me on your show. I watch it regularly and I love it.
Thank you, Yeshayah, very much. So this is a mutual situation because I think the world of you as well. But let's start with our organization, our former organization, where it's all about the people. And the people, you were there much longer than I was only there 8 seasons. You were there 24. But still, there's a feeling, it's a special place. Is that safe to say as we start today?
Yes, it is. But my unique lens to it is it's actually the only place I've known professionally. Right out of college, I came to the Giants and I grew up in the organization. So I get the special feeling because people come back or they've been there and they tell me when they arrive that there's something special about it, but it's really all I've known. So that's kind of a unique feeling. It's just home. It's just what it is.
So in looking back on your 24 years there, when someone says, okay, Yeshayah, crystallize it, tell me what you felt, experienced, and ultimately can say about that experience, what do you say to folks?
I think people feel seen and heard in the organization in a real way, as people that they're cared about, even after they leave. Like that's what's interesting is I've had, David Bell comes to mind. He was with the organization for a couple of years. He came in to run player development and I knew him as a player. So I was working in the clubhouse in 2003 in the video room, besides other jobs I was doing in the front office. And, we became friends and he was like one of the more professional, just nicest people, obviously a very high baseball IQ. So I knew him then. And then I knew him when he came back to organization and he had spent 15 years at that point away from the organization. And he told me, he's like, there's nothing like the Giants. Like that year I spent with the Giants is extremely memorable to me and important. And then he felt the same thing when he came back. So that's an example, but I've heard that from a number of people. And I think something unique I think about Giants fans is they really attach to players or they want to, player after player, obviously a Sandoval and a Bumgarner, like those are going to be, but it's all the way through the roster and it really always has been. And I think like there's an attachment that the city feels. And a lot of that's really credit to the work that you did when you were there, Chris, telling the story about the players, building them up in the public. But I think the players feel that too. But I think it's also a feeling that staff have as well, both from the city, but internally.
Gosh, you could get me going on all the players, like the roster of players that just fit into that description that you just had beautiful there. Pablo Sandoval, Tim Lincecum, Matt Cain, Vogelson's story, Hunter Pence thrived as a Giant. He was a great Astro and a Philly, but my gosh, he just thrived as a San Francisco Giant because of the atmosphere. Okay, I want to talk about you, though. We'll get to the players in a bit. And thank you very much for the kind words. As you know, it was a group effort, but thank you. Let's look at this, Yeshayah. You started as an intern out of UC San Diego, and then you rose all the way to VP, Baseball Resources and Development. So much experience and in so many lived moments, right? Personally and professionally, because I know you're a fan as well in those years. What was it like early on becoming an intern at the Giants and acclimating to the world of baseball? You were a great pitcher at UC San Diego with the submarine style. But tell us first about those initial years as a Giant.
My senior year, I realized I wasn't going to play in pro ball. And I really loved the game and wanted to stay in it. I wasn't the leader on the field, but I chose to become the leader off the field. And so I brought that as an intern. In retrospect, as I think about it, like my job as an intern was data entry all day. Was a key part of it. It was right before hotels had enough Wi-Fi for scouts to enter their scouting reports over computers. So they would fax and mail me all their scouting reports. So I had this big stack of scouting reports on my desk, and I would just enter it into our database all day. And then during the game, I would go down and help the video person before the game, did a little video replay station off the dugout. And so I was able to learn the game through the scout's perspective. I could watch those players at night, see what they were seeing, learn the language, but then I could also be a fly on the wall, basically, around players and coaches. A skill I feel like I've always had is I'm a pretty good observer. So like I try to learn from what I'm doing. Like I think back of my days as an intern as much as as like joyously as I would when I was a VP. I've always like lived in the moment and try to make a difference where I'm at. And so I don't really see them as different. I actually don't even see them as more impactful necessarily, which sounds kind of weird. I just think like you can impact the space that you're in at whatever level you're at. And you're just impacting different things depending on like what your responsibilities are and who you're interacting with.
That's so interesting that you're getting these scouting reports as a brand new professional in Major League Baseball, and you're entering them into this gigantic database. So when you would get let's say something from the Midwest Scout or the West Scout or the Southern Scout, right? You knew they had a style, right? That they saw pitchers
100%.
in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
Or middle infielders, they would always say like certain things, oh, he's fluid and he's able to cover a lot of ground. He has great range. Things I'm just making things up. So would you look forward to certain scouting reports based on the individual giving them, and not for entertainment's sake, but you could see things through their lens, knowing, okay, well, they have 18 people in the big leagues that they scouted over the course of 15 years. Is that fair?
It is very fair. It's like they have their own style. Stan Selesky, who since passed away, he used to write stories almost. They were long, which I didn't always look forward to him because it was a lot of writing. But you could really visualize the player while they're doing it. While other people were like direct and to the point, you could still visualize it. But they didn't waste words. They were just like, this is who they are. This is what they're going to be. But yeah, I love it. And it was a great way to learn the game from the bottom up. So like I even starting as an intern, I started scouting local amateur players on my own on weekends. I'd be at the game every day, so I would scout them while I'm watching them. And so over the years, no matter what my role has been, I've actually always entered scouting reports into our system because I love that part of the game. I love the evaluation part. And even, I end up becoming kind of the Moneyball analyst with the team in the draft room. And I was our analytics department and then built it. So like I'm given the analytical opinion at the trade deadline and free agents and throughout the year with any decisions we make. But I do think like it made me be a better analyst, the fact that I could evaluate players as a scout as well. And I obviously learned from some of the greatest in terms of Brian Sabian and Dick Tidrow, and then also all the scouts that I was entering reports from.
You seem to, and I know you, but you seem to have a beautiful blend of the two, which is, let's even add a third. So you have scouting, you have intuition, and then you have analytics. Is there anything I'm leaving out? Because any access to any information to make a great decision on a player, you have to be like bullheaded to not take advantage of all the categories. Did you see it that way? I'm sure you probably did, and I'm leaving something out.
Yeah, and actually, you're leaving out probably the third pillar, which is player development.
Yes.
So I ended up overseeing player development over time, and that's one of my pillars too. And it's really the different sides of evaluating players and developing them, both of them. And I think it's really important to be well-rounded. You don't get it right away, but being curious and learning the different sides of the game is super important. And it allows you to like kind of have a fuller picture of who the player is and who they can become. So in player development, you know, you sign the player, they enter your organization, and then they're going to be with you for often many years. The average is about 2.5 years they're with you, but many players are there for 6+. Some are there shorter, and you have this small window in this player's lives to get them to become a big leaguer. And you're trying everything to get them there. So there's a physical part of it, developing them physically, but there's also an analytical part of it. They're developing a profile for themselves on the field so you can see things, their strengths and weaknesses analytically. And then there's a scouting piece of it. Like the scouts are going to see things the analytics won't. And there's a coaching piece of it. And the difference, I would say, between scouts and coaches, sometimes they overlap, but a lot of the times the coaches really believe in the player. They think they can get them better. They think they can improve them to get the big leagues. And the scouts are often looking at the things they can't do well and why they probably can't get to the big leagues. Or if they get there, what their weaknesses are going to be, because a really good coach believes they can help someone develop and be better. And so that's like the dynamic. So like living between those spaces in my career has been fascinating. And it's been important, like as I'm talking to a coach and they're evaluating a player, to know that they're probably going to be a little higher on the player than maybe the analytics will say or the scout might say, because they're going to believe in the player. It doesn't mean that they're going to be wrong. It just means that I need to know that that's kind of the lens that they're viewing them from.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Yeshayah, throughout your years, you start and you look at, you had Dusty Baker, Felipe Alou, and then you go into Boch, right? The Bruce Bochy years, which were obviously incredibly significant, Hall of Fame. I mean, just amazing with the championships. And then you go into other eras that had success, but ultimately didn't play out the way that everybody wanted it. When you look back at the different eras, what do you think of?
Honestly, it's hard for me to separate them because, yes, they're different eras in terms of the leader of manager. And there's just so much more under the hood that's going on beyond the major league team that I'm involved in. So like, that's where the eras really blend. Sometimes they're players, sometimes it's just a roster situation in a given year that you're adjusting. And so like, a minor league system is fluid. You're going to have a draft every year. And really like, as the calendar turns, you're really focused on what you're working on then. So there's going to be a spring training, there's going to be a draft, there's going to be a trade deadline, there's going to be an off season. This is kind of on the front office side. And then obviously there's games every day at the major league level. And so the way I looked at it is I'm doing spring training right now. I'm going to make it as good as I can be, but I know I'm going to do it again next year. So let me, at the end of kind of finishing that, I would always write detailed notes to myself about like, how can it be better? And then I would look at those notes in December when I start planning it again, so I can build off of what we did the year before. And so that's kind of how I saw it. So it kind of just like everything that I did would build off of it. But then to kind of really answer your question in terms of those different managers, I think some of it is unbelievable men and leaders. and presence and kind of who they are. And they all kind of brought their own personality to the team. And a lot of the coaching staff underneath them were actually the same coaches as well, which is why I probably don't think of it as different leaders. Like Rigetti was there most of it. Wotus is still with the Giants. So like just consistency like throughout the organization. So even though those are different eras with coaches, there was a consistency that they just kind of like blended into each other in some ways. Bochy wasn't a former Giant, but him and Sabian had like kind of almost like a brother's relationship that was very unique and really special in the game. And Sabes had a good relationship with Felipe and Dusty as well, like all of them. So that's very unique. And I think something I have learned over the years is like that relationship is kind of an important uniter for an organization, is that manager and that general manager, because they need to be on the same page and they need to fight sometimes and communicate. And really, actually, Farhan and Kapler had that same relationship. They could almost finish each other's sentences. I remember even in the interview process with them and watching them interact, and they just were very aligned. And I think it's why they were just such a good match for each other. And, the Giants won 107 games in 2021, under Kapler's leadership. And that was the most the organization had won in the history of the Giants. So that relationship has been important. And I think I took that and tried to duplicate in other places in the organization. So whether it's my relationship with somebody, Bobby is one of the best communicators I've ever been around, Bobby Evans, and he was able to build that relationship throughout the organization too. So maybe it goes back to the culture at the beginning, but I think it's been nice that it's not completely separate eras. It may look like it from the outside, there is Bond's time and then kind of moving into Posey and the new group. So those players change and things do change on the roster, but from the inside, it doesn't feel so separated, I guess.
I understand that completely, especially from your lens, because you were part of the glue keeping it going and keeping that foundation so there could be sustainable success, like you just said, at the major league level and then all the levels of the organization. I'm going to say something. I want to see where you go with this. You mentioned Sabian, and Brian's relationship with Bochy was kind of brotherly, right? And by the way, Bobby Evans was on this podcast. He was our 100th episode. I still think about that conversation. Yeah. We have a ton of mutual respect for that gentleman. Just an amazing person. Speaking of amazing people, I think, so Brian Sabian is going to the Hall of Fame. There's not a question. That guy is going to the Hall of Fame. He's still doing work with the Yankees, right? I still think he's underrated. Because he's understated, right? Yes. He's a humble, just get after it. I just think the world of him as well. Personally, I had interactions with him that were unbelievable, and I was just the content guy. Anyway, my point is, how does leadership in those eras and on your entire time at the Giants, there's a combination of confidence, humility, and as you said about Bobby Evans, great communicating. All those attributes that you would put as the pillars of great leadership took place at the Giants and are still taking place with Buster and everybody doing the great work they're doing now as we enter the 25 season. How did that manifest itself? How did it happen? So amazing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think creating atmospheres where you can voice your opinion and be yourself are super important. Sabes is fiercely competitive. Like underneath it all, like he wants to win badly. And I think when you work closely with him, I think players feel it. I think coaches feel it. I think front office staff that work with him feel it. And I think that is a separator. When you can feel it when you're around them, it like makes you want to make that happen, like what he wants. And it makes you more competitive too, not with each other, with other teams around the league. If we didn't play well or we we had a poor season, he was deeply embarrassed by that, and he did not want to have that happen again. And you can, you all feel that a little bit, but he had it to an extreme. And I credit that kind of that through in terms of like who he is, and that permeated throughout the organization. And there was like a respect for him around that, because his mind was always towards how we can get a little bit better, always. And then everyone has their own kind of leadership characteristics. I was very close to Dick Tidrow throughout the years, he oversaw our amateur draft, oversaw player development, both of them, which is very unique. And he could just see things in players that other people couldn't. And he was extremely creative. So I consider probably him and me like being two of the more creative people in our group, and we played off of each other really well. And creativity, there's a lot of it in scouting where you see a player and they might be catching, but you might think, this player probably is a pitcher. So there's like changing of positions potentially. You're trying to imagine a player who's young being on the major league. So there's a creative element to that when you're developing them. There's creativity, and then just being kind of open to trying things with players as you're developing them, and them trusting you and being open to being developed. And so I think that there was like high regard to both of those men, just kind of having, I don't know the right term for it, but like seeing things that kind of normal baseball people can't and players, but also being able to articulate it. And they were wrong a lot of the time too. You're just going to be in baseball. And they were very direct and like clear about what they wanted. And I think that that's important too, and gets lost in it, where it's better to know where you stand or what they want or what they're looking for in a clear way, instead of like kind of beating around the bush, which they rarely would do.
Speaking of creativity, and then I want to go to something that you said about your personal note taking and journaling. Yeah. We're going to get to that in a second, but you brought up the creativity factor. Buster Posey was an infielder. He played different positions in college, right? And I remember at the Giants in his earlier years, there was talk perhaps of third or first, right? But he wanted to remain catching. And the Giants had the presence of mind to, I don't know about allowing him, I'm sure it was a collaborative conversation, anyway, the bottom line is he remained a catcher, but there was at least creativity with him playing other positions. Whereas other organizations might have insisted he play other positions. But needless to say, it all worked out. But tell me your thoughts on that, right? Specifically, and it's a wonderful segue into talking about Buster, his leadership, and how he was as, again, a Hall of Fame player.
Yeah, we drafted him in 2008, and it was John Barr's first year as our scouting director. And I remember we hired him in January. He came in, probably the first conversation I met John. He said, "I want to draft Buster Posey." And Buster, like on Baseball America, was maybe like 24th or 25th, and we had the 5th overall pick. And so John had a long history with him. He believed in him. And knowing John now, like, he'll fall in love with players for sure, like any scout will. But there was something special about Posey then, and he just believed it, which was fascinating. And in some ways, he probably shouldn't have made it to us at 5. He was just the 5 overall pick. 4 other teams passed on him. And, John like gets to know players really well and does his homework on them. And he had that special feeling about Buster. And I don't think it ever left. Like when we got him, everyone that Buster has interacted with, his track record shows who he is. He wasn't in the minor leagues very long. I probably got to know him a little bit better after the minor leagues than in the minor leagues, because he just wasn't there very long, which is a testament to him and kind of how advanced he was as a person and a player. And so, I think the creativity with him, I don't know that there really necessarily need to be one. Like we draft him as a catcher. That's who we saw him. That's what he was at Florida State. And like, he didn't really struggle. So when players struggle, that's sometimes where you need to get creative, because sometimes changes need to happen just to get them to the big leagues. And he was one of the rare players that didn't.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, let's get back to your note taking and how you have processed things over the years that has helped you as you advanced more in your career. What was that? Tell me about that. Like, you would have a habit of writing things down and taking copious notes at key moments throughout the season and your life.
Yeah. It's something I actually didn't think about doing until actually leaving the Giants in January. Someone gave me some advice to just start writing down things that you've done. And so I just started actually going through all the documents I had created since I had been with the Giants. And I kept coming across these documents that I called brainstorms. And this is going back all the way to like 2001 when I started as an intern. And so I've got them year after year. And they're really like, it's kind of like waking up in the middle of the night and writing a note to yourself so you remember it. And so I've got one from '01 about like ideas to help integrate Latin players into America when they come over for the first time in Arizona. I wasn't working in player development then.
Wow.
And then, but we ended up implementing a lot of it in the next few years. I have one that I ended up turning into a memo in 2008, which was an idea to create player development plans for players, which is, we ended up implementing it that spring. And it's basically like sitting down with a player, myself usually at that time, and, our hitting coordinator, a pitching coordinator, or at least a coach in the room, and really like showing them analytically areas that they're really good at and some weaknesses to improve on. And then also it allows the coach to be able to talk through like potential adjustments to like help those areas, or more from a qualitative standpoint, things they can work on. So really like being open and upfront with the player, like where we see them, and giving them more of like kind of some markers for themselves about where they can improve and get better to get to the big leagues in a clear way, which I don't think we had done as well before then. And so we've done that every year since then. You end up sitting down with every player. They've advanced since then. They're a lot more visual, much cleaner, those player development plans, but every team does it in the major leagues at this point. I think Cleveland had been doing it by the time we started, but we were one of the first. And it's like you might do with anyone that wants to learn and develop, is it gives an opportunity or a time and place for that communication to happen in a clear way.
One more question, and then we're going to get to all-star moments. When you look back at the 24 years you spent at the San Francisco Giants, what is the number one thing you enjoyed the most about it?
Oh, that's hard. People come to mind big time. I love baseball. And so like, I think every single morning I worked there, I woke up and like was excited to attack the day and help the Giants become a little bit better. It sounds really corny, but it's true. And so I think like being in an organism is maybe the best way to describe it, of a bunch of people that are kind of pulling on the rope in the same direction, trying to win. And just that feeling. And particularly when you talk to other people you work with that clearly are having that same feeling you have, that's at the core is probably what I think about and smile about most. So it's not like one instance, it's more of a feeling, a daily feeling.
Nice. Nicely done. We will get to all-star moments in just a second. To grow as a leader, you must make intentional choices about how you want to show up for yourself and your team. Are you ready to grow your leadership? The Gargano Leadership Group offers expert coaching, consulting, and workshops rooted in our 4 leadership pillars: curiosity, alignment, optimism, and self-awareness. Leadership starts with forging authentic connections, communicating your values, leading with energy and enthusiasm, and truly understanding yourself. Visit garganoleadership.com to get started with us today. Back to the show. Okay, all-star moments. Here we go, Yeshayah. First thought, best thought. 2010, 2012, 2014. You have to pick one singular moment that stands out in those championship runs. You got one moment to share with the millions of people that listen to this podcast all the time.
I mean, Pablo Sandoval's 3 home runs. That was pretty good.
The most impactful leader you had in your years as a Giant?
It's probably Dick Tidra. He was one of a kind, and he didn't let many people in, and I was lucky enough to be one of those people let in. And he was serious, but he was also goofy, and he could really he really knew the game at a deep level, and was kind of a difference maker for us. And I'll give you a second one that we haven't talked about. He was not in baseball operations, but I'm a big fan of Bill Newcomb.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously Larry, other people outside the Giants have been great. But I think when Bill came in, I think it was 2008 or 2009, he really had an impact on baseball operations, in my opinion. He came in, we were at a time where we were coming off 4 losing seasons. You're coming in as a new president. Some new presidents might have turned over our entire baseball ops then. I think that that's common in sports. And when he came in, he actually built us up. He said, you are all really good at what you do. I think you're the best in baseball. And then he often would ask us just kind of tough questions. He admitted, I don't know that much about the game. You know much more than me. But he would ask us questions like, if we're making a trade, why? And very targeted things that forced us to just be a little tighter in our decision-making processes. And I think that tightness really led to better decisions being made and forced us to kind of reevaluate some of the things we were doing and how we were doing them. And I give him credit for that too.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed him as well. Very talented and very nice man.
Yeah.
Okay, couple more for you. Your singular leadership memory that you have from all those years at the Giants, when someone just impacted you in a moment or a quote or something someone said to you that really changed the way you saw things.
I can't give you a single one. I can give you an ongoing one. Bobby Evans was my direct supervisor for a long time, and we would do a review every December, which was a little more uncommon on the baseball ops side than the business side. But what I appreciate Bobby is he always had really good advice for me. And it was very targeted, and sometimes it hurt a little bit, but that was good. He was willing to go there. And I think it made me better over the years. And as I was going through my documents, I still have all of those. So it was kind of fun to go back and just kind of see some targeted things. And now I go back and I'm like, he was absolutely right.
Where is the sport of baseball in 5 years?
The internationalization of the sport is continuing to grow. So having obviously Ohtani probably as the face of baseball is a big plus. The World Baseball Classic was so in its early years and was amazing the last time it happened. And I think that that's really going to help. And so I think I see things positively, but I actually think that there's a lot of little things that are happening that are growing the game at the basic level. And I'm excited about that. I think that there may be some opportunities. This is not baseball, but in the softball space, Athletes Unlimited is doing some interesting things, but I would love to see kind of a softball professional league that develops in the next 5 years if we're talking about that. And I think that actually helps baseball grow the game as well, because there's enough similarities between the two. There's a few women's baseball teams in college that are playing in Southern California. I think that there's a league. And so there's just some areas that the game could grow outside of maybe where it's grown in the past.
Okay, and lastly here, what advice do you have for somebody who's in a similar situation as you? Maybe they played college baseball, maybe they didn't, but they're interested in going into baseball ops as a career. What would you say to someone in 2025?
Oh, love it. It's very different from when I came out. There's a lot of people trying to enter the game, and I say that as a challenge, not as something to dissuade you. I think you can do something right now to prepare yourself for that, which you may not realize. You don't need permission to permission meaning get the job to start doing the work. Just do it. If you love it, you're going to need a passion to work in baseball. It is a lifestyle. It is not necessarily a 9 to 5. And so whether you're in college, whether you're in your community, like, see if you can do some work for your baseball team in college or your softball team in college. Every single, September, October, November, December, a bunch of job postings are up there for every team. Look at them, see what teams are looking for, start develop those skills and see if you like it. But then also you're gaining experience because other people that you'll be competing against are going to be doing the same thing. It's going to sound cliche, but be the first one there, the last one to leave. Learn with everything you're doing. Be a leader in your space. And I would say that I kind of talked about it earlier, but I also don't think you need permission. You don't need to be the general manager to be the leader or the manager of the team. I really think like leadership can happen at all levels.
That's great advice. Tremendous advice. The key to that leadership, that the gem, right, that is leadership is like you said, baseball's hard. It's day to day. It's a grind. There's no other way. You even put it a couple of times, a lifestyle.
Yeah.
So picking people up and taking care of them is part of it. You can't just be transactional, come to work, get the job done and go home. You're there all the time. Yeah. How did you do that to pick others up and to see when somebody's a little fatigued or, you've got people on your staff, this person's low, this person's too high, and creating an atmosphere where there's room for everybody because, hey, guys, for people, men, women, people, we have 8 more games on this homestand. We've got to be there for each other.
Yeah. Great question. I try to be really consistent. Like, I think that that's part of it. Where someone comes to me or I come to them, I'm usually pretty much the same. And maybe it's my personality too. I think it's engaged in the moment, like being literally in the present. It seems small, but you could say, hi, good morning to someone and say their name and be present and not present, and people can tell. I think if someone's coming to me with something, like that's the most important thing at that moment because they wouldn't be coming to me with something otherwise. And that's human nature. And I would say the same thing about myself. If I'm putting myself out there, if I'm sending someone an email with a question or I'm asking someone a question, like I'm doing it for a purpose. And sometimes there's 1,000 things going on and like, yes, things might slip through the cracks and yes, I might not be perfect, but I would try to approach it that way. Because you're thinking about short-term and long-term too, like those relationships that you're building, like you have an opportunity to develop that person at that moment in that conversation. You also have an opportunity really to help them make a difference because oftentimes they're coming to you because there's a bottleneck, right? It might be like, hey, I have this idea. Can I move forward with it? But they're kind of stuck until they get the okay or they get the feedback to move forward. And then I think those relationships are real. It took me a while to learn this because I don't think of myself as a networker until recent years, until some of the recent work I've done. We've been kind of our own team, our own group here. And I've never been someone who really wants to like leave the Giants and like work for another team. So I didn't like put time into it, but something I have learned, and this goes kind of into your everyday question is like, you really never know who people are going to become or what they're going to do and what that relationship will be long-term. For example, me and Farhan used to play basketball in spring training in like the early 2000s when we were both starting our career. And then he's my boss one day, for an example. But I have a lot of people like that. And it could be people who might be your intern one day, but they may hire you one day. You may leave the organization, hire them. Those relationships are real and they're meaningful. It could be an informational interview you're doing with someone or they do it or they do with you. And you just don't know. It's sometimes a small world. There's always something you can learn from that conversation, but like being present and curious and in the moment, that just adds up over time. And it doesn't have to be for a purpose of getting something. It's a purpose of like learning and moving forward. And often in work, it's like you're trying to accomplish something. So it's like it's the immediate task at hand. But within that, over and over and over, you're building consistency, and that's kind of the consistency that leads to winning.
It does, right? And that's
It really does.
exactly. And you said something interesting, and it's a Maya Angelou quote, and I'm going to paraphrase. It's not what we say, it's not what we do, it's how we make people feel. It's rooted in how you make someone feel. So after that exchange, when someone they leave you, they're going to have a feeling. What do
Yeah.
you want that person to feel? This has been tremendous. I can't thank you enough. What a wonderful conversation.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
love it. Thanks for reaching out and inviting me on the show, Chris. I'm honored to be here, and it's just really good to spend an hour with an old friend. And you're doing some amazing stuff. So keep doing what you're doing. You're making organizations and the world a better place.
Thank you very, very much. And we thank Yeshayah very much for coming on the show. I'm going to give you a little behind the scenes of the podcast process this week. Before I hit record with the guests, I will catch up with them. And I'll say, hey, what is new? Anything else you want to talk about? While Yeshayah and I were catching up today, he said, hey, how would you feel about looking at my high school baseball coach's top 10 principles to live by? I said, sure, forward them along. And I said, if I like them, I'll try to find a way to put them on the podcast. He said, that would be great because they really impacted my life in those key years of high school, right? Yeshayah, class of 1996 at Berkeley High School. So let me read these to you. Coach Tim Mollering's top 10 principles to live by. And Coach Mollering passed away in 2011, which makes these obviously even more impactful. Here they are, 10 of them. Number 1, have empathy for everyone. Number 2, tell the truth. Number 3, be reliable. Number 4, assume positive intent. Number 5, be physically active. Number 6, just do it. Number 7, don't blame anyone. And each one of these has a description underneath. So I'm going to read you just a part of this one. Don't blame anyone. Underneath it says in caps, this is key. No one is to blame for anything. Only you can change what you do. Number 8, your possessions can be replaced. Number 9, carpe diem, seize the day. Number 10, solve your problems. Fantastic. So glad Yeshayah forwarded me these top 10 principles to live by the late Coach Tim Mollering. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this episode and all of Keep the Line Moving. We will see you next week. Thanks for tuning in to Keep the Line Moving. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a review. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Most importantly, share this podcast with your friends, family, and coworkers. It means the world to us. If you have a guest recommendation, visit our website at garganoleadership.com, where you'll also find all our archived episodes. For our marketing coordinator and the producer of this podcast, Savin Narwhal, I'm Chris Gargano. Have a fantastic week, everybody.